We will hear Dr. Linda Zampol Dortia. Dr. Zampol received her MA in Religious Studies at the Universities of Padua and Venezia, Ca' Foscari, Italy. Her PhD thesis looks at identity building and negotiation in the 16th century. In the 16th century Jesuit mission in Japan, with particular attention to Superior Francisco Cabral. Her current interests are the early modern society of Jesus, Portuguese-Japanese relations in the 16th century, and early Orientalism. Her paper this morning is entitled Purple Silk and Black Cotton, Francisco Cabral and the Negotiation of Jesuit Identity between India and Japan.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Professor Lorenzen and Professor Cervera before starting for their kindness in inviting me. The main topic of my talk today will be Jesuit clothing and how it ties into the building of Jesuit identity, missionary policy, and ultimately cultural adaptation, or lack thereof. My research follows the activity of Portuguese Jesuit Francisco Cabral, 1533-1609. Cabral entered the Society of Jesus in India in 1554, where he held the positions of Master of Novices and subsequently Rector. In 1568, he was promoted Superior of the Japanese mission. On arrival 2 years later, Cabral was not impressed by the state of the mission, reporting to Goa and Rome how the Jesuits were not following the correct way of proceeding of the society. One specific problem he was called to solve was the use of silk in the clothes of the missionaries. Today, I will briefly consider the absence of habit in the tradition of the Society of Jesus, and then move on to see how the Japanese mission dealt with this situation in the first decades of its existence, considering how clothing is tied into the building of Jesuit identity, missionary policy, and, as I said, cultural adaptation. As any Jesuit will be quick to tell you, his religious order does not have a habit, that is, a specific set of garments prescribed in the constitutions. Moreover, the founder, Ignatius Loyola, did not leave behind much on the topic. The constitutions of the society briefly describe the dress the Jesuits were supposed to wear. They did so in Part 6, the one dedicated to the personal life of those already admitted or incorporated into the society, in Chapter 2, that is, what pertains to poverty and its consequences. The clothing, too, should have 3 characteristics. First, it should be proper. Second, conform to the usage of the region where one is living, or at least it should not be altogether different. And third, not contradictory to the poverty we profess, as would happen through the wearing of silk or expensive clothes. This refers to those to whom the house gives clothing anew. This ought not to be used in order that in everything, humility and proper lowliness may be preserved, unto greater glory to God. There are another 4 points that consider the dress of the Jesuits in the constitutions, and none of them give a detailed description of how it should be. The text says that the dress' first purpose is protection from cold and indecorum, as opposed to, for example, a sign of contemptus mundi. And that should be never forgotten. The constitutions also say that it helps fostering unity among the members of the order through exterior uniformity. So it is expected for the Jesuits to wear clothing similar to their brethren. The text returns often to the point that the dress must be poor. Loyola therefore never specified a color or a shape or a material for the Jesuit dress. This attitude was rather common among religious founders, such as St. Augustine or St. Benedict, even when the aim behind the promulgated text was total uniformity among the various convents and houses which were part of the order. The 16th century, however, had very specific needs regarding clothing. The sumptuary laws that were multiplying in all of Europe in this period were aimed at regulating social divisions by limiting the spending and public flaunt of luxury items and clothing. These laws could be extremely detailed in what was permitted and what was not, and were peaking in number around this time and throughout the century. Clothing in this period mattered very much on a social level, as Loyola himself had learned during his life, such as in the occasion of his encounters with the Inquisition in Alcalá de Henares, where he was forced to change his clothes, made of sackcloth, with a common student's dress, to avoid being considered an alumbrado. Or even earlier, during his youth, when he was denied clerical immunity because he was not wearing the clerical dress, even if he had received tonsure. The habit of the Society of Jesus became a point of contention already in 1554, when the Sorbonne produced a document that condemned the society, and one of the accusations was that they did not have a habit that distinguished them. Loyola, in his responsio, replied to this accusation saying that they did indeed have a habit, which was the same of the clergy of the region where they lived. He then concluded stating that, dressed like this, they could carry out their duty to be everything to everyone. So, while Loyola proclaimed indifference towards clothing, not just any clothing would do for the society. I think this can be explained considering the fact that the habit, as any type of dress, is what modifies or is added to the body, and Loyola had very specific ideas of what the Jesuit body should be like. Modesty and external composure were very valued by our father in the members of the society, wrote Luis Gonçalves de Câmara in his memorial. Rules referring to the behavior of the Jesuits were set so that they could show the modesty and humility and religious manners and good example and edification to everybody. So the Jesuit appearance needed to reflect the seriousness and spirituality of the Jesuits himself and of all the order. In the 16th century, the color black had acquired symbolic values connected with aspects of this image that Loyola wanted for his Jesuits. Black had been recently saved from the connections with the stain of sin that had sustained for centuries. It had been ennobled by the use at the court of Spain, the use by clerks and other professionals, and by the rising merchant class and civic leaders. No respectable man would now wear bright colors. Moreover, black was still associated with poverty and humility, which were fit characteristics for a Jesuit. The dress Loyola finally chose was therefore the black cassock of the clergy, which was rather similar to the student's dress he had worn in Spain and that had later kept to travel in France and Italy. This does not mean, however, that local variations among Jesuits did not exist, as for example, the Assistancy of Spain wore brown, except for Aragon, which used fine black cassocks. A brief note on color. Black could be extremely expensive due to the techniques used in its dyeing, as the one used by the court of Spain, for example. The Jesuit black instead used none of the existing expensive dyes and was black more ideologically than in practice, just as it had been in the case of the Benedictines. It was more probably a blackish, dark gray cloth, and this is why this color respects the vow of poverty. Obviously, if it had been luxurious black, that would have not worked. As we can see in the images on the right, the closed cassock covers most of the body of the Jesuit. The white collar typical of the clergy is not yet in use. If anything is visible on the neck, it is the shirt. The hat on his head is a biretta. The figure on the left is instead the Jesuit outside the house, wearing a long black cloak that was not related to the short one in use at the Spanish court in this period, because the short cloak was not considered poor garment, instead the long one was. The material is not specified, but it was generally rough wool or cotton blends in warmer climates. Considering these regulations regarding dress, it is not a surprise that the Asian headquarters of the society in Goa became extremely worried when they received word that their brethren in Japan had begun to have a close relationship with silk, both in their clothes and in their houses. It is not clear who informed them. but it is evident that Jesuits in India felt the need to intervene already at the beginning of the 1560s. According to Francisco Cabral, the use of silk began around 1564-65. At this time, Indian provincial Antonio de Quadros was trying to obtain permission from Rome to visit Japan to solve the, I quote, grave necessities of those parts, but never succeeded. On the Japanese side, in 1565, we have the first letters by Cosmo de Torres, superior of the mission, where he asked to be substituted, requesting a younger but experienced Jesuit for the task of returning harmony to the mission. After failing to visit personally, in 1566, de Quadros sent a visitor to Japan, Pedro Ramirez, who, however, died before reaching it. Only in 1568, Francisco Cabral was nominated for the role. According to his letters, he was tasked by the provincial to do a general visitation of the mission, to investigate and solve eventual problems. Only while already traveling, he was reached by visitor Gonçalo Alvarez' most drastic orders to get rid of all the silk and the share the Jesuits had in the trade with Macau. As Franz Josef Schutte pointed out, this order is rather perplexing, since Alvarez has no first-hand knowledge of Japan to be able to take so drastic decision. However, it seems that, according to Quadros, the visitor had a tendency to ignore completely the context and try to apply inconsiderately the constitutions. It is also true that Alvarez had intention to visit Japan personally at a later date, and that initially Cabral's was not supposed to be superior there for more than a couple of years. However, Alvarez's ship sank in sight of Nagasaki in 1573, and Cabral had to settle for a long stay. Francisco Cabral was not impressed by the state of the mission when he reached Japan in 1570. Aside from lamenting, as Valignano would do later, that the situation there was much worse than what was communicated back to India, Cabral summarized the history of the problems with clothing to both Goa and Rome. After a period of extreme poverty endured by Francis Xavier, Cosme de Torres, and Juan Fernandez, the situation had changed with the entry of the society of the brother Luis de Almeida, who, I quote, brought with him 4,000 or 5,000 cruzados, with which the trade and the dealing started here in Japan as well as in China. With this abundance, this state of things began to expand throughout the mission, together with the capital, until 7 or 8 years ago, when they started introducing silks and colored clothes. As a somewhat justified redundancy of his letters show, the first years of Cabral's stay in Japan were highly conditioned by the instructions given to him by Alvarez, and by the idea that his visitation would last only until the visitor himself would arrive. His letters show his worry with informing his superiors that he was following orders regarding silk and doing visitations. Only after 1574, he starts showing more attention towards the general direction of the mission in his letters to Rome, instead of giving attention only to specific matters. However, while making clear that his hands were tied by his orders from Alvarez, Cabral never suggested that he did not agree with the general gist of them. He, in fact, affirmed that he had ordered the whole mission to abandon the colored silk clothes, because not in line with the poverty and humility of the society, that the bigger part of the expenses of the mission was caused by this pomp, and how this behavior also prevented the good care of the Japanese Christians and other activities of the society. In general, the reasons why silk clothes were not acceptable were, first, they were not proper, mainly for the reason of their bright colors. Second, they were not compatible with the vow of poverty. And third, they were not necessary to adapt to local uses because some Japanese Buddhist monks wore black cotton, and they were respected just like the others. Cabral was rather upset when most of the Jesuits resisted his orders, and instead of obeying, started explaining to him why it was necessary to use silk clothes. I would not be able to describe to your paternity the work I had to do for this, and the temptations, because aside from Father Cosme de Torres and Father João Battista, he's talking here about Italian Giovanni Battista de Monte, to whom also it did not appear a good thing, most of the Jesuits were against changing clothes, and they told me that taking away the silks was to close the doors of conversion of these lands, because the Japanese only looked at the exterior, as we did not wear silks. And if we wore black, not only no Gentile lord would pay us any attention, but not even the Christian converts and other issues that were based on vanity and the excessive license that had been introduced in the mission. It is possible at this point to identify three types of situations in which the Jesuits in Japan would use garments that were not standard to the society: for church rites that require special solemnity, for reasons of personal safety, and for reasons of prestige among the Japanese. With the growth of the communities of Christian converts, the Jesuits found themselves in the situation of having to be official pastors of their flock during processions and special occasions, which went together with their being the local secular clergy. In his Historia, Freud was very careful to point out how the major glory of God was always behind this sort of behavior. On Gaspar Villela, for example, he wrote that he rode in a red lacquered litter, wearing a brocade cape, because he was intrepid and zealous for the honor of God, and knew how important this ceremony was, since it was the first public funeral done with solemnity. It appears then that particularly important rites, such as funerals, made use of silks and colors. This continued for the time of Villela, that is around the beginning of the mission, to the beginning of the 17th century. Thanks to the same Historia, we know how Cabral too used robes of splendor for this reason. In chapter 103, Freud described a quite curious episode. In 1574, while Cabral was baptizing some nobleman in the fortress of Takatsuki, an old Christian man approached him, asked him to be baptized again. When rebuked that he should know you received it only once, the man replies that, "Now that I see this altar so ornate, this cope you are wearing, and these pieces for the baptism that are so lustrous and rich, I was envious of this gentleman, and I wondered if, by the chance of the poverty in which the father found himself, lacking all these things, I was baptized or not." It seems, therefore, that in keeping with both European and Japanese tradition, starting from the beginning of the mission and until the persecution that would terminate it, the use of luxurious items and clothes in special occasions was widespread. The aspect of the activity of the Jesuits in Japan was never directly mentioned nor censored by Cabral. The fact that he himself was part of a rite that made use of instruments, decoration, and garments that were technically against the war of poverty suggests that he understood both the role of the society as a secular clergy and as pastors of the Japanese flock, and the deep connection between luxury and sanctity that was found in both Japanese and European traditions. He probably allowed this in the understanding that it was done for the reasons of edification and ultimately for the major glory of God. The other two situations in which the Jesuits were wearing non-standard clothes relate to the attempts of the Jesuits to adapt to Japanese culture and how they understood their identity as Jesuits. In the first case, silk was justified by personal safety of the missionaries. Japan, in the first years after the establishment of the mission, was in continuous state of war. The roads were not safe, and the political situation could change drastically in a very little time, which often left the missionaries no other solution than escape, leaving behind most of their belongings, and often communities of converts. Very soon, they start following the practice of disguising themselves as poor traveling monks. In 1559, for example, Villela, brother Lorenzo, and a dojuku named Damian went to found the mission of Miyako. Freud wrote in his Historia that the group left for that new and strange peregrination without taking the ornaments for Mass, because they just went to explore the land and to pass more freely among heathens. They all went, like it is custom in the land, with shaved heads and beards, wearing their poor kimono, conform to the intent of their pilgrimage. Freud does not mention the color or any other feature except their being poor of the kimono worn by the group, as it generally happens when talking about this sort of disguise. There is just a general reference to the monk's dress. Cabral was adamant in refusing the reason of personal safety as a valid concern behind the change of clothes, calling it fantasies of faithless people. Of his 1571-72 visitation to Kyoto, he says, "I have recently come back from Miyako. that was the name of Kyoto at the time, where our God, our Lord, gave me so many mercies that I cannot emphasize them more, because even if they frightened and alarmed me with great concerns and telling me it was necessary to change the dress and travel anonymously with silk clothes, I nevertheless wanted to travel more confident in God and in the obedience for which I was doing that travel, more than in the means they gave me. So I went with my cassock, and he probably means a zucchetto here, a type of very flat hat, calling myself in all kingdoms and lands I passed a father of the Society of Jesus, and preaching his name through a Japanese brother who was coming with me. Not only when going, but also when coming back, no peril they had told me about happened. But in this manner, Kubo-sama, that is the shogun, and Nobunaga, and all the great lords of those parts gave him much honor and favors to me, who was dressed so poorly, that all the Christians and heathens were surprised. Some noblemen converted, and many others too, and they asked for preaching from many places. It is interesting to note that the poor kimono of 1559 mentioned by Freud has disappeared, to be substituted by silk clothing. Even if Cabral always mentioned the presence of silk, it seems that this is not the most pressing problem. When it comes to travel, according to Cabral, it does not do to disguise oneself, no matter how. The proper way to go for a Jesuit was to announce himself as such and to preach the name of Jesus Christ while traveling without fear. Cabral created direct connection between God and his clothes. His cassock, in his opinion, was a direct proof of his faith in God. He strongly implied that Nobunaga, the shogun, and all the other lords honored him not despite his clothes, but thanks to them. His refusal to wear silk was also connected to holy obedience, which is presented as the reason why he is traveling instead of, for example, any reference to the rules for a superior that direct he is to do visitations, and therefore to the structure of the Society of Jesus itself. Divine providence and obedience to the hierarchy are strictly connected. Cabral was visiting Japan on orders of Provincial Antonio de Quadros, and he was prohibiting silk on orders of Visitor Gonçalves Vares. Divine providence was on his side because he was following saint obedience, and he showed through favor and conversion. The use of the Jesuits of traveling as monks was therefore a lack of faith in God and in obedience, and therefore in the society. This attitude was particularly worrying, moreover, because in Cabral's eyes it took the shape of a dangerous Nicodemism, both in its form to use the monk's attire and in refusing the cassock, which would push the society in Japan to asunder from its origins and core. The Japanese mission was moreover understood as a place of frontier, probably for its position and for the lack of Portuguese political power, and as such particularly inclined to cause perdition. The way to show instead faith was declaring openly oneself as Jesuit, dressing like a Jesuit, and doing so become a true servant of this saintly Society of Jesus. God's mercy would then operate on the hearts of the Japanese, grant conversion, and a successful mission. This is basically Cabral's idea of missionary policy. For him, who had entered the Society of Jesus in Goa, the only possible Jesuit way of proceeding was the one adopted in India, and by extension, Portugal. He was very explicit in declaring that he wanted the Jesuits in Japan to become like the ones in India. Of the elasticity allowed in the constitutions, there's no trace. This consideration makes particularly interesting the last instance of silk wearing and Cabral's reaction to it. This would be prestige among the Japanese. It took two correlated forms: the possibility that lack of prestige would stop conversions, and the Jesuits' relationship with the upper classes. With the first one, Cabral dealt very quickly. Here you can see the letter that he wrote to Antonio de Quadros explaining how he did it, and basically he simply went out in the streets of this small town dressed like a Jesuit and looked at what was happening, and what happened was just that the children were staring and nothing worse happened. This obviously was a very limited experience, since Sakai, this city, had an established Christian community and was relatively safe. But it was enough to convince Cabral that the Japanese would not ridicule the fathers in the streets. A conversion would not suffer. More interesting is the relationship with the upper classes. Francis Xavier himself had understood the importance of impressing them, apparently wearing luxurious clothes during his visit to the daimyo of Yamaguchi. And it is rather possible that the other Jesuits, too, had started wearing luxurious clothes following his example. According to Frois, it had started with the New Year's traditional visits to the shogun in Miyako, when the fathers followed the suggestions of the converts and the example of the Buddhist monks. The old Christians of Miyako, following whose experience the father had to behave, begged insistently the fathers to allow as much as possible in the clothes, since these great lords were so proud and would be affronted and insulted if the fathers had appeared in front of them with common and ordinary clothes. Good clothes would reflect better credit and reputation on the Christians, wrote Frois in his Historia. Fathers Villela and Frois, in this occasion of the first visit to the shogun, wore the only luxurious clothes they owned, that is, clerical vestments, the same ones they were using for baptism. Once extreme poverty was overcome, it seems they preferred to use local clothes, their choice falling on silk kimono. It is possible that the reasons that good clothes would reflect better credit and reputation on the Christians prompt them later to use silks also when outside the residences, instead of only when visiting important people. This is probably the reason why the following accident occurred in Nagasaki, in the solemn occasion of the arrival of the Portuguese merchants. One time, Father Baltasar da Costa went to welcome the incoming ship of the Portuguese, with many people accompanying him, and he was wearing purple silk. A Portuguese man went to embrace him, but he put forward the fan he held in his hand and told him to not get close, because it would scandalize the Japanese. Since Cabral considered the feudal lords as the key to the conversion of the country, he was more cautious dealing with them. To see if this excuse by the other Jesuits was true, he started by asking the opinion of some respectable old Christians in Sakai. I asked for advice to the owner of the house about the change of our clothes, asking him to clarify to me if maybe he felt that using our cassocks and capes without any silk would be of any impediment, because they are so alien to our vows. He replied that he thought it very good, that we dressed like priests, and although in the beginning it would be a novelty to some, after everybody would think it good. After 3 or 4 days, some of the most important citizens of Sakai, among whom a Christian, came from a banquet. After giving some explanations, they concluded that it was very well done. Cabral similarly asked to the other feudal lords during his visitation and apparently received similar answers. When he reached the capital, he made a visitation to the shogun, where he was very careful to follow Japanese etiquette, declaring himself a good courtesano. Cabral considered this visit as a success too, thanks to the grace of God, always in his interpretation, even if it's not clear from the description he gives if this was actually true, also from the point of view of the shogun. When they moved to Gifu to meet with Nobunaga, the warlord were very interested in their change of clothing and seemed to be happy with the reasons given by Brother Lorenzo, that these were the clothes they ordered were in India, and now it was not necessary to wear silks anymore, because they were well known in Japan too. Nobunaga then appreciated Cabral's attacks on Buddhist monks, as he generally did, and concluded honoring them with presents. After this meeting, Cabral became certain that the Japanese nobles would not object to any change of clothing, and considered the matter closed on all fronts. However, the Jesuits were not so easy to convince, and lack of obedience of Cabral's orders would be common in the subsequent years. So, to conclude, it is possible to see how the matter of the clothing was just the tip of the iceberg of a wider question of adaptation and missionary policy. Regardless of the Constitution's openness to adaptation, Cabral believed that the cassock was a too important part of Jesuit identity to be disregarded for mere earthly matters. Holy obedience to his superiors and the need of God's grace for the conversions sealed his opinion. He was, however, not unable to see the possible consequences of offending the Japanese feudal lords, and moved in a cautious way so as to avoid scandal, therefore, in a certain sense, adapting to the need of the dress to be conformed to the usage of the region where one is living, as the Constitution said. Cabral refused to accept the rationale behind the local Jesuits' attempt at adapting to Japanese culture. However, very aware of the need not to cause scandal, he did not reject adaptation per se, but found a solution by giving an alternative, a self-serving, interpretation of the same culture. He decided to follow the tradition of the monks dressed in poor clothes instead of silk, and confirmed with the Japanese elders and nobles that this was acceptable. This maneuver allowed him to find a space to negotiate between Jesuit European customs as exported to India and Japanese tradition. Considering how the number of converts rose under his superiorate, Cabral's missionary policy might have been an efficient strategy. Considering, however, the general unhappiness that pervaded the missionaries when the visitor Valignano arrived in 1579, and how Cabral himself considered the mission doomed, maybe it was not so efficient on the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Linda Zampol. Now we will open half an hour period for questions and commentaries. First, we'll be open to the panelists here, and then we will open to the public. So please, if there are any questions, you please say to which of the papers are you referring. Por favor.
Yes, I would like to ask Professor Chen, how did the Chinese mathematicians, did they consider their algebra with some kind of relation with the West, with the Jesuits? I mean, for example, I am thinking, I studied more astronomy, and in, you know, the Chongchen Li Shu, after it was a first edition, Xiyan Xinfa Li Shu. I mean, is the calendar book according to the new Western methods. After, the Western word disappeared, and it was only Xinfa Li Shu. I wonder if the methods you have studied so deeply, they consider that they were new. In some place, they say this is a new method, Xinfa, maybe Xuanfa, Xin Xuanfa, a new method of calculation, and if in any place they say that it has something to do with the West, with the Jesuits, I suppose no, but if you have seen some mention for the Jesuits or nothing at all. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the context should be clear that you know, Kangxi Emperor and other high court officials, in order to justify learning of Jesuit mathematics, they have to say that 西学中原, so Western learning, Chinese origin. So really, they actually put everything under this big banner that everything came from China. So then, especially in the compilation of 喻制数理经运, the numbers and principle of, I should say, the method and the principle of mathematics, really, in a way that they put such image that even though certain things were introduced by the foreign missionaries, everything is Chinese, right? So even though the scholars actually understand that some of them, they called it 东来法, meaning the methods that came to the East. So they knew that these methods were sort of introduced or reintroduced by the Jesuits, but then they, because they have this way of justifying that, okay, even though these methods were introduced by the Jesuits, but originally they were all from China. So that's how.
It was like
right.
rediscovery for them.
I think they avoid the term new, right?
Professor Corsi.
Well, I have another question for Professor Chen, which regards circulation and dissemination of the text, because you said that before the notes were confined to the Neu 4, so to the Imperial Household Department, and that they were given a printed form by, later on by mathematicians. So one question, well, two questions basically. What was the training of those mathematicians? Were they philosophers who later on began to, or were they technically trained in mathematics and they also did some philosophy? And another question about the circulation of those texts. If you've been able to track down the editions, for example, how many printed editions of those texts? Were they ever used as manuals? In terms of education, what kind of circulation of algebraic knowledge was disseminated during the 18 and 1990, up to the 19th century? Thank you.
Thanks. So I want to clarify this a little bit. So when you ask about whether these scholars were mathematicians or they were philosophers, you were talking about the Jesuits?
No, I'm talking about the Chinese.
Oh, Chinese scholars, yes. Okay. Well, I mean, they...
referring to the Chinese...
Sure. I mean, these scholars were I think they consider mathematics as a part of the classic learning. So then for them, even though a lot of writings were about mathematics, I mean, they were, I guess you can consider them to be philosophers foremost. Like Jiao Xun, I think another contribution he had was the study of Book of Changes. So I mean, they were closely related. I mean, of course, I mean, some people argue that the reason he was talking about why A times B equals B times A, maybe he sees something from the study of changes that if you have different gua, so first you have this, then you have that. When you reverse the order, they actually mean completely different things, you know. So then now that was one reason. The other question about the different editions or the dissemination of Jesuit mathematics, it was mostly through the reprint of Shuli Jingyun. So I have to say that I don't know how many printings there were afterwards. But then, as I have shown, that there was one in even mid-19th century. There's one. I mean, I think there was order or decree that they let the provincial governors to reprint them and then distribute them. So then, most things we can see by the Chinese scholars sort of based on the learning of Shuli Jingyun. So it wasn't based on the Jesuits' original editions, right? So I mean, those were limited. Yeah. So that, yeah.
Por favor.
I would like to ask a question to Linda on her paper on the issue about silk for clothes, which, of course, as you know, becomes central to the mission in China later on. And Matteo Ricci's whole strategy depends on approaching the literati, the Confucian literati, and therefore he would very much have agreed with his Japanese friends who decided to wear silk. Now, I guess that the silk-wearing Jesuits won the battle within the Jesuit order. how do you judge that to be, I mean, how do you think the result was reached? Was it reached because they have more political influence or because the reasonings were more powerful? That is to say, that the decision of Valignano to support the more flexible approach to clothing against Cabral's position was the position of Valignano as a kind of a well-placed Italian aristocrat with connections with Acquaviva, the reason why in the end that strategy succeeded? Or do you think that there were clear evidence that without that policy they would not have been able to go forward? I mean, how do you judge the evidence of success and failure, the practical aspects, the weight of the reasonings against the connections of the people making the decisions in deciding that?
Well, I think that the situation in China was quite different in the sense that, as it is well known, when the Jesuits entered China, they were first dressed as monks. And it's quite interesting to see here how Cabral, who was in China at the time, was actually quite happy with this situation. He thought that the monk's dress was poor, was black, and so it was acceptable for the Jesuits. Apparently, Valignano was not of the same opinion. It seems like he believed that it was dangerous for the Jesuits to dress like monks because people would think that they were Buddhists. So there was this problem here, which I think was not perceived by Valignano as a problem when Matteo Ricci dressed himself as a Mandarin. So, because the Mandarin, I don't think, was perceived as a religious figure. So, Valignano had learned in Japan that it was dangerous to connect Christianity too closely with Buddhism. With the, I'm thinking about, for example, the accident with the translation of the name of God, which accidentally ended up translating as Buddha, translated as Buddha. So I think that Valignano had learned that lesson very well. And when he was put in front of an apparently similar situation in China, he understood it very differently. And I also think that Valignano personally did not have the same understanding of Jesuit identity as Cabral did. Cabral was a nobleman himself, but he was Portuguese. And for example, he applied a very Portuguese understanding to the concept of obedience that Valignano himself did not have. Valignano liked to think that Italian Jesuits could apply the modo suave, the gentle way of preaching, of conversion. And I don't think he was worried about the fact that Ricci was wearing silk, but was more worried about the fact that Michele Ruggeri, for example, was wearing a monk's dress. So I do think that while they're sort of both Cabral and Valignano come from a quite similar social environment, their takes on Jesuit identity were quite different. I don't know, does that sort of reply your question?
It does help, but I guess that my question really was, why does Valignano win the day? I mean, in Rome. I mean, do you think it was a question of rational arguments? Do you think it was a question of who was better connected? I mean, Cabral loses the argument, doesn't he?
Oh, right, I see. Sorry, I had not understood this part of the question. Okay, it seems that lately the interpretation of what actually was going on has changed from the traditional one that could be, for example, Schute's interpretation of the problems between Cabral and Valignano. Cabral really wanted to leave Japan. By the end of his superiorate, he was in a very bad mental state. This comes up quite clearly from his letters. He, for years, asked the general to recall him to Rome. He's not interested to stay in Japan. For him, the Jesuit Japanese mission is doomed. There's no way out. So he tries to stop some of Valignano's changes, not all of them. He agrees with some of them, but he's not that involved anymore. Then he's sent back to China and then later on to India, and it's in the 1590s that he, I think, is in a better position to start criticizing again Valignano, particularly because by that time he's seeing the situation as a sort of war between the Indian mission and the Japanese mission. He perceives them as enemies, and therefore he's very, very upset by the fact that Valignano gives priority to Japan. He keeps to remove him from the position of visitor of India to limit his influence. And so I think that by the time he gets back to India, the situation has changed again. He perceives himself as Jesuit of India, and he's not interested in the Japanese mission anymore. He's not interested in fighting certain types of fights. Then again, he was very badly informed of what was going on in Japan at the time, so he did not really have any way of supporting his own arguments anymore.
Thank you.
I have one also.
Bueno, I'd like to thank Elisabetta for going back to Pedro de la Piñuela. When we had this joint project several years ago about Franciscan missionaries, we sort of started work on him and never got very far with it. The other thing I just wanted to mention is not a question, it's more of a comment. And I know this is also something that Inés Supanov has worked on, is the problem with medical texts. In my work on the Capuchins in India, I ran across a big medical manuscript by somebody called Domenico da Fano, and seems to combine knowledge that he picked up in India, knowledge he picked up in Tibet, and knowledge he picked up in Europe, although when he came, apparently he didn't know any medicine at all. But most of these missionaries sort of ingratiated themselves with the local population, or many of them, by means of giving free medical treatment. And many of them didn't know much about medicine when they got there. And so if anyone wants to work on this, I would recommend this treatise, which is located in the Capuchin archive in Rome. Well, also we can give some comments about rocks, but I think we'll forget that.
I have a question for José Antonio Cervera regarding the image that is in the program. I'm a student of images, so I'm very much interested. This one is very interesting, and it raises 3 questions of interpretation. First, the letters in the bottom, they're written in Spanish. It looks like it says Fray something under the European. On the left, it says La something Juana. I wanted to... Okay, but let me finish. In the back, we have 2 buildings. One is a European church in the right, and in the left, it looks at another building. My question is first, if this is an image made in China, it looks like, because the Chinese man is very well represented, looks that way, like he was a witness. But the building in the back is not so well represented. So I don't know if it is a religious temple. It's supposed to be a Chinese temple or something.
I will show the. Okay.
Also, I would like to know if the writing under the Chinese man is a name or a title or a transcription of a Chinese word.
Yes, you have here the place, the first page, because this book, in fact, lacks the front page, we can say, so we don't have the title. This is why different researchers gave different titles. I gave the title used by Villarroel. But this book, there is only one copy, one stamped copy in the National Library of Madrid, and it arrived there, who knows how, because as I explained, this book probably was very little disseminated, and there is, in the first pages, before, there are some things very funny writings in Spanish, because I suppose maybe in the 17th or 18th century, this book arrived to someone who had no knowledge about Spanish, and there is something very funny. So someone, this is like a graffiti. It's written La Señora Juana y Fray de Gracias. Yes, it was written by someone who didn't know Chinese. In fact, also in some place, you know, in the Chinese books are written from not like this, but the other way. So there is also in Spanish. Este es el principio del libro. This is the beginning of the book. For if someone didn't know. So this is like, I suppose it's like a joke, maybe 18th century, I say, but I don't know. So la señora Juana y Fray de Gracias, la señora Juana, because they saw this person and he thought that this was a woman. And about the different buildings, of course, on the right, it's clearly something related to West, maybe a Greek temple or like this. On the left, I don't know, because also this is not a typical Chinese temple, but remember, it was written, it was published in the Philippines when they had just arrived, and Cobo and all of the Dominicans had never been to mainland China. So I suppose they had some idea about what China could be. I suppose, I don't know, but I suppose the Greek Western temple is very straight lines, and the other is more circular lines to oppose the two, I mean the West and the East, maybe, I don't know.
Gracias. From the public, por favor. Professor Marston y Cristina.
My question is for Professor Cervera, and as you know, my interest is particularly Southeast Asia, and I was fascinated by the fact that Cobo had apparently never been to China and was doing all this in the Philippines, and so based on this text or other things you know, can you make any generalizations about the Chinese community he was relating to, their intellectual life, and to what extent was the project of the mission? Well, we know that ultimately they were interested in mainland China, but to what extent was their project with the Chinese in the Philippines?
Well, at that time, in the 1590s, there was already much knowledge about China, first because of the Portuguese. So the Portuguese had arrived to mainland China in the beginning of 16th century, in early, and especially in the 50s of the 16th century, they had settled in Macau. And after, for example, in 1585, Juan González de Mendoza had published his very famous Historia del Gran Reino de la China. So I think the Dominicans who arrived to the Philippines, they had all this background about the knowledge about China, especially South China, taken to Europe, and from Europe to New Spain, and from New Spain to the Philippines by the Portuguese sources and the Spanish sources. And in Cobo and other Dominicans there, they had relation with the Chinese who had arrived to the Philippines, especially to Manila, from the 70s of the 16th century. So at that time, in the 90s, the beginning of 90s, probably thousands of Chinese were there. But these thousands of Chinese were mainly people who went to sell some goods. I mean, they were not literati. They were mainly, how to say, mercaderes or
Merchants.
yes. So this is why I wondered why the Shilu that is written in classical Chinese is written, and so I found this quite interesting point of view by Lucille Chia, and very new, that it was like a kind of, the Dominicans said, okay, we can do this. Not only the Jesuits can do it, we can do it too. When we will be able to enter China, so we will be able to do this, but in fact, probably this book, the Shilu, was had very little dissemination. So I would like to ask also, because I wanted to ask Anna, and it's very related to this. We saw that the Cobo Shilu had very heretical, we can say, something about the Taiji Uji and the Li, and so you have studied the Dominicans. Navarrete is nearly 100 years later, not so much, but, and I had the impression that Cobo's Shilu would not be possible in the second half of the 17th century. We have the idea that in the 17th century, especially with the controversy of the rights, Dominicans and Franciscans had the orthodox view against the Jesuit view. As I proved in the beginning, I mean in the 16th century, the Dominicans, apparently, the book by Cobo was as open as the more open of the Jesuit books. How do you feel about Navarrete times? He was more cautious about what it was possible to do and it was not possible to do, or not?
Just, thank you for the question. Just one question related with the Chinese in the Philippines, because the situation changed in the second part of the 17th century, because if during the first time the Chinese in the Philippines were as merchants and only people related with bill offices, on the second half of the 17th century, in the Spanish documents are referred the Chinese with education, Chinese with some economic level, and these were the Chinese that helped to the translations and helped the Dominicans to enter the Fujian area. For example, Victorio Richo, in his Hechos, incorporates some testimonies of many Sangleyes or many Chinese with a very well known of the classics, with a very well known of his own history, and Richo incorporates this in his books. Just to complete a brief. And another source, I'm sorry, because I'm thinking in the governor's letters of the 17th century, there are also reference to the changes about the Sangleyes that were living in the Parian of Manila. Just to
José Antonio, if I can only make a very small comment about the printing, the date that you have provided, which is 1593. This is a very early stage in the Chinese mission, as far as the Jesuits are concerned. So I'm sure that they had no knowledge, and the Chinese the Jesuits by that time had not produced anything, almost anything. It takes Matteo Ricci 10 years to reach Beijing. So 1593 is too early to be able to say that the Dominicans wanted to produce the text that was an erudite, a text produced in classical Chinese, because they felt that there was a challenge. They didn't feel anything only, like that.
You know, 1584
so, I mean, if this is Lucille Dia's position, I think it's quite Ruggieri. Questionable.
It's the only.
Sorry.
I mean, in 1584, it was published the Tianchu Shilu by Ruggieri, Michele Ruggieri. This was the first book. Yeah, and I think, at least Lucille Chia thinks that when they saw this publication in 84, okay, so the Dominicans thought, okay, we can do it as good as you, the Jesuits. Of course, Matteo Ricci had not produced anything until now, very few.
I think I agree with Elisabetta's question and point here, because I think that to read in this moment the later disputes, I mean, retrospectively, that there is a rivalry with the Jesuits so strong is not entirely correct if we consider that very actively Alonso Sanchez had been working in the Philippines for the conquest of China. So the most prominent Jesuit in the Philippines, who Cobo would have been familiar with, was not really a defender, I mean, of these kinds of apologetical works. And just because Ruggieri had published a book in China, which was some kind of catechism in Chinese, to say, well, we have to show we are as good because we want to go to China too, it seems to me, is to read kind of a later dispute into a moment when it's not still so strong, where the debate in the Philippines is between those who believe in conquest and those who believe in mission through peaceful preaching, rather than between Jesuits and Dominicans about methods. I don't think that debate exists, and that's why you see a Dominican openness, because the Dominicans are not defining themselves against the Jesuit method of accommodation. They are trying to do something with the Sanglays. I think this is a book written thinking about engaging the traditions of the Chinese on the basis of the existence of the Sanglay community, which will then lead to the possibility of going to China. To me, that's my interpretation of it. So I would agree with
You
you.
allow me to make just another small comment. Books are physical objects. The fact that Ruggeri published Tianzhu, a catechism, does not mean that it had a wide distribution so that Cobo in the Philippines could have knowledge of that. So on the other hand, on the right side, there is written, if I'm not wrong, if I can read properly, Xingke. That Xingke means that this is a new edition of something that was printed, that was carved before. So that means that this book has already some kind of tradition. Have you been able to do research in this aspect? For example, I would be very interested in knowing the Sanglay's printing press and the carvers who actually physically worked in the production of this book. Have you been able to do anything in this respect?
No. I think this Xingke means that this is like the first edition, but Cobo had arrived, the Dominicans had arrived in 1587, and this book was published in 1593. It's amazing that so quickly Cobo could learn Chinese, probably with help, of course. And the book is not translation, but adaptation of this book by Luis de Granada. But for example, this book, and it's written there, he uses the term Tianchu. And Tianchu, as you know, at that moment, there were different terms for God, and they were wondering, should we use Tien or Shanti or what? So I think, maybe I am wrong, that Cobo had to know the Tianchu Shilu by Ruggeri, and probably this is why he used the same term, Tianchu. So I think he probably knew Tianchu Shilu by Ruggeri, but who knows, maybe not. But I think this term, that it was very good, and this is the term used today for Tianchu Jiao, no? So, well, Cristina. Sí.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Linda. Actually, Francisco Javier was the first one to use silk in Japan. Well, when he came back from Kyoto, and then he went to Yamaguchi, he used silk to open the doors in Yamaguchi. So why did Francisco Cabral talk anything about the change that Francisco Javier itself did in his clothes, not using anymore the clothes that he was using at the first when he arrived in Japan? No. What did Cabral say something about Francisco Javier changing the clothes, because he was the first one to change it?
Oh, thank you. Well, actually, the fact that Francisco Xavier had changed his clothes was not completely accepted by everybody. Schuramer does, on his book about the life of Xavier, does a very interesting list of sources about this event. And basically, what comes out of this list is that Xavier clearly brought some presents to the daimyo of Yamaguchi, but it is less clear if he actually literally changed his clothes. Most of the details about this event seem to be later addition by European writers. For example, Valignano believed that Xavier had changed clothes. But Cabral, in his own description, did not accept this version. So he has a very idealized idea of how the life of the mission was at the times of Xavier. And in his letters, this fact that he might have changed clothes is completely absent, even if it's quite probable, at least it is present on Il Giappone by Bartoli. It is presented that Cosme de Torres himself said that Xavier had changed clothes. But in Francisco Cabral's version, this aspect is cancelled, basically. And we don't really have, for what I could see, we don't really have that much historical proof that this actually happened. The only witness that I could track down was Bernardo, one of the first Japanese converts that then traveled to Europe. And it is suggested that possibly it was him that propagated this idea, but the sources of the time are not clear, really. Most of them say that he bettered his cassock, literally, and do not really mention this change into silk. But I was not really able to reconstruct exactly how this change of clothes then made way in the lives of the traditional lives of the saint.